All right, so we have mainly been just working with some small, non-real data for the most part, just to kind of get familiar with data types and data structures. We have seen a few instances where we imported some data sets along the way, but now we're going to start getting into working with more real-life data sets and getting familiar with how to handle those data sets and doing some data analysis on them. But before we jump into that, it's good to have a good understanding of how Python actually works with data, right? So Python stores its data in memory. So this tends to make it relatively quickly accessible when we're doing data analysis, and we'll see that for the most part as we go through future lessons. Now, for this class, we are mainly working with small to moderate data sets. We're not working with what we consider big data. So we're not going to have any issues with running into space limitations. However, as you work with much larger data sets, you may have hundreds of millions of observations if you're working with like a large retail business. You can definitely run into memory constraints with Python. Now, there are options of using Python to work with distributed data, and we can do that through like PySpark, which allows us to use the Spark language and interface to do distributed programming. And we can also work with relational databases such as like SQL. But for the most part, we're mainly going to be just looking at working with small to moderate data sets so we get a familiarity with how to do some basic data analysis steps. Now, the way to think about how data is imported and used within Python is basically these three steps. We have data that sits on the computer or a server that we're working on, and we often refer to this as that data is on disk. Now, we use Python to basically make a copy of that data and import it into your Python session. So it's being held within the Python session memory. So the Python is then the data is then sitting within the Python session memory, and it's ready to be used by your other Python code. Okay. So that looks kind of like this, where we have some data set here on disk, right, on the computer. We import that within our Python session. It takes up some memory, right? It takes up dedicated memory within our Python session, but then we can use code to interact with this, whether it's to do some basic analysis, to do some machine learning models, and so on. Now, an important thing to remember in this process is that the second that we actually turn off our Python session, or let's say we shut down our Jupyter Lab, then the data that we had stored in Python memory, that is gone. It is no longer accessible. It no longer takes up memory. Okay? So if we simply import data, do some analysis, but not write this data back out to disk, right? Then the result is going to be gone. We're no longer going to have access to it. Right? We'd actually have to do another step of saving the data after we've done some analysis and write that to disk so that we can then shut down our Python session and then open it up later on and still have access to that data. All right, so just realize that when we import our data and we do some analysis on it, the second that we shut down Jupyter Lab, or maybe you're using VS Code or PyCharm or some other IDE, the second you shut down that Python session, the data that you had stored within your Python session is no longer in memory. It's no longer available. So you need to write it out if you want to save it for later use.